Welcome back, and thank you so much for staying with us here on ENCA. We're in conversation with Mike Greenaway, the author of the Fireside Springboks, the untold stories that made the Boks so great. And we know how we celebrate their greatness. So Mike, just before the break, we were talking about the history that brought us to where we are, especially with regards to transformation. But I want us to go back. I mean, in the book, you say 1906 was the first time that the Springbok emblem was displayed. But even the color green, why was it called the Springboks in the first place?
Yeah, it's an interesting story how the Springboks got the green. The first time South Africa played international rugby was in the 1890s, and they were still students of the game, and teams from Great Britain came to play in the Cape Colony, and South Africa was still really learning the game. They lost, I think it was something like 10 matches in a row in the 1890s, and when they finally won a match, it was 1896, and the captain of the team was a gentleman ironically named Fairy Heatley. I say ironically because he was a massive man. And how it worked in the way back then was that the captain of the South African team chose the colours that they would play in. They didn't have a specific kit at that point. Fairy Heatley's club was Old Diocesans in Cape Town, because he was a bishop's old boy. And their colour of that club was green. So the Springboks played in green, and they won the match. It was the first time they'd ever won a match. And green is known as the colour of hope, and it was also seen as a good omen that they'd won a game and they'd worn green. So that became their colour from 1896. Regarding the Springbok emblem, they didn't have an emblem at that time. And then we get to 1906, as you mentioned, the Springboks now travel overseas for the very first time in history. And while they're on the ship over to England, the captain of the team, Paul Roos, has a discussion with the team, and they come up with the idea that they would like to be known as Springboks. They get off the ship in Southampton in England, and the British press are there. And they ask Paul Roos, what do we call you? And he says, the Springbokken. And they became known as the Springboks.
Okay, it's a beautiful, beautiful history and a beautiful story. But of course, it also largely influenced by the French Huguenots, as you say in the book, in those days, or descendants thereof.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The French Huguenots, the origin was in 17th century France. France was a country where Catholicism was the religion. There was then a Protestant movement that broke out across Europe, which was against the Catholic Church. It was Christian. And in France it was called the Huguenot movement, and they were persecuted in France, so they got on ships, a number of them, and came to South Africa. And that's how you get popular surnames like Dupree, De Villiers, Du Toit, and quite a lot of Springbok players have had those surnames. There was quite an interesting story in 1966, I think it was. The Springboks went to play in Paris, and the French got so excited because they recognized all these surnames in the Springbok team, and organized a banquet for their adopted South Africans of French origin.
That's very beautiful. I mean, you obviously had spent a lot of time in research, and not only from your own writings in the past almost 3 decades, but you had from your scrapbooks to having to dust off literally volumes and volumes of research. Talk us through that process.
Yeah, exactly. So when I had the idea to write the book, I looked at what I had from it was then 25 years of rugby writing, and I did find some decent stuff. I also found quite a bit of my stuff was a little bit sort of outdated or been overtaken, but I had a nucleus of a book. And then I just thought, if I wanted to do real justice to the Springboks, go back to the beginning and do some serious research. And I read 29 books on the history of the Springboks, and I went right back to the 1890s, right up reading autobiographies of players as recent as Siya Kolisi. And I just discovered such interesting stories. The thing about humans, and it's a perfectly natural thing, is we tend to focus what's in our consciousness, what's in front of us, and that's great because the guys, in terms of the Springboks on the field right now, are fantastic. But what if I told you we'd always had these magnificent players and characters? They've just been forgotten. They in their time were famous, but they've now kind of slipped out of focus. So what this book does is to bring a lot of those characters back to life, give them a second lease.
And it's untold stories. I mean, and it's self-explanatory. It's very, very heartwarming. And I quickly want to talk about the haka. I mean, the rugby team has been dabbling with some idea of a war cry in response to the haka, and that almost went epically wrong or an epic fail. And in the book, you call it here the haka, white men can't dance.
It's a funny story.
Tongue-in-cheek, yes.
Yeah, so this thing with the New Zealand haka is kind of been an issue for so many of their opposition because they seem to have an advantage. And it is an advantage because they get all boosted by this adrenaline-inducing war cry of theirs, and the other guys, the opposition, has got to stand and watch and then play, and these guys are all amped up. And this has been going on forever. And in 1928, the Springboks decide, no, hang on, this is not fair. We're going to come up with our own war dance. And these are white guys. They decide they're going to do a Zulu dance, and it was a disaster. It came out as gibberish, and the crowd, instead of getting behind the team and thinking, wow, we're all amped up, the crowd thought it was hysterical and burst out laughing. And so they abandoned it. Funnily enough, the Springboks actually won that match, but they abandoned trying to do the haka.
I think they were playing for pride more than it ought to save face. But now, obviously, the national anthem, when you see the passion, with the Springbok players, some even with tears in their eyes when they sing the national anthem, that is the response to the war cry, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah. An interesting thing the Springboks under John Smith did to try and diffuse the haka is you'll see that and the Springboks still do it now. When they're playing New Zealand, they take the field in tracksuit bottoms. Then they face the haka. Then they go to the sidelines and take their tracksuit pants off. They only do that when they're playing New Zealand, and that's so that the power of the haka is kind of wanes a little bit. So it just sucks a little bit out of the impact.
And it is a mental game as well. I mean, when the Springboks go, or any other national team, you can imagine the pressure that's on them. They're carrying the pride of the nation on their shoulders, and you need to bring your A game mentally, so especially. Yeah,
the thing that I've learnt about covering rugby, and it was something that was taught to me by a former Sharks and Springbok coach called Ian McIntosh. He coached the Springboks in the early 90s. And when I first started rugby writing, and I went down to my first Sharks practice, and he took me aside and he said, okay, you want to cover rugby at the top level, you've got to learn one thing. These guys are human beings. They're not machines. They will make mistakes, and if you write about them in that way, that no one goes out to make a mistake, no one drops the ball on purpose. If you are conscious of that fact, then you'll go a long way in your rugby writing. If you just come out shooting from the hip, guns blazing, telling them they're useless, says your career will last 5 minutes. So what do you want to do? Are you in it for the long haul, or are you going to be right about these guys? They're trying their best.
And you've captured it so beautifully. But we're going to have to take a quick ad break, and we'll be back with the last segment of the bookshelf. Really fascinating, speaking to the legendary, prolific Mike Greenaway, who is the author of the Fireside Springboks, the untold stories that make the Boks great. Stay with us.